All right, let's dive into a real bone chiller, shall we? I know our listeners eat up true crime, and today we're going way back to one of history's biggest unsolved mysteries, Jack the Ripper.
Ah, Jack the Ripper. It's kind of wild how, even after all these years, people are still obsessed with this guy. I mean, just picture it, right?
Hmm,
1888, London, the fog, those gaslights, the Whitechapel district. It's practically a horror movie setting.
totally. Whitechapel was a rough place back then, with all the poverty and crime. It's
Mm.
like the district itself is another character in this whole Ripper story. And then, of course, you have the brutality of the murders, women working as prostitutes, targeted just for who they were.
Yeah, that's what makes the Ripper story so interesting. It's not just about the killings themselves, but also the social stuff going on back then, the fear people felt, the poverty, the way immigrants were viewed. It all kind of got mixed up with the whole Ripper legend.
For sure. And when we talk about the victims, we got to talk about the canonical five, right? Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Their stories are like the core of this whole case, just reading about how they were murdered. Each one worse than the last. I mean, it's chilling.
It really is. The canonical five are the ones everyone pretty much agrees were Jack the Ripper's victims. And those murders, the way the bodies were mutilated, I mean, it's like looking right into the killer's messed up mind.
Totally. Each murder seemed to get more and more violent. It's like the killer was getting bolder, like he was almost confident with each victim.
Yeah.
And that night, when he killed both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the double event, they call it Obaman, that must have terrified the whole city.
I can only imagine the panic. Knowing that this guy could kill twice in one night, that's next level fear. And this case, like a lot of famous ones, really makes you think about how the media can mess with an investigation.
Oh, absolutely. And when we talk about media hype, we can't forget the Dear Boss letter. This thing was sent to the Central News Agency, and it's where the name Jack the Ripper actually comes from. The way that letter taunted the police, even promising to send them a victim's ears, is just bone-chilling.
That letter, Dear Boss, whether it was really from the Ripper or some crazy hoax, totally changed how people saw the case. It got the newspapers going nuts, and honestly, it might have even slowed down the investigation with all those fake leads.
Yeah, it's amazing how many theories and suspects have popped up over the years about this case. There was even that claim, not too long ago, that DNA evidence points to Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who lived in Whitechapel back then.
Oh yeah, the shawl they supposedly found at one of the murders. Russell Edwards, he wrote a book about it, claiming that DNA from this shawl links back to a relative of Kosminski's brother. Sounds pretty convincing, right?
So, is that it then? Does this DNA finally solve the case after all this time? I'm super curious to get your take on this.
Well, it's not that straightforward. The DNA they tested was mitochondrial DNA, which comes from your mother's side. It can connect someone to a whole family, but it can't tell you exactly who it is.
Okay, I see what you mean. But even a partial match like that, doesn't that still make him the most likely suspect?
Not necessarily. Don't forget, we're talking about DNA from a shawl that's, what, over 100 years old? Who knows how many people have touched that thing since 1888? The chance of it being contaminated is huge.
Wow, you're right. That's a good point. It makes you realize how important it is to protect evidence properly. I mean, if this was happening today, with all the technology we have, they'd probably have this thing solved in a week.
No doubt. And here's another thing that makes me raise an eyebrow. The police weren't involved with testing that shawl at all. If this DNA was really a game changer, wouldn't they be all over it? Something just doesn't add up. It really shows you how tough it is to work with these old cases. But even back then, the police had their ways of trying to figure things out. Like, they thought maybe the killer was a butcher or a surgeon because of the way the victims were, cut up.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, those cuts were so precise. You'd almost think someone who knew anatomy had to be the one doing it.
Right. But there was this police surgeon, Dr. Thomas Bond, who examined the bodies, and he actually said those cuts weren't done with, surgical precision. He even came up with a profile of the killer, saying he was probably a loner and had these, periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, whatever that means.
Whoa, that's pretty wild. So even back then, they were trying to get inside the head of the killer. That's like early criminal profiling, right?
Right. Totally. And when you add that profile to the fact that there is no clear motive and the attack seems so random, it made the Ripper even scarier. He wasn't killing for revenge or anything personal. It was something darker.
Like something straight out of a nightmare. And the fact that they never caught him, I mean, that just adds to the whole mystery. So besides Kosminski, were there any other big suspects that the police looked into?
Oh, Tons. This case, it just attracts theories like crazy. Remember, this was a time when people were really anxious about immigrants, so a lot of the theories focused on foreigners.
It just shows how fear and prejudice can really mess up an investigation.
Exactly. And back then, the newspapers loved to play up those fears. They'd print these sensational stories that just made certain groups look even worse.
That's kind of sad. I mean, all that media frenzy, it's understandable, but
Yeah.
it probably made things harder for the investigators, spreading all those rumors and freaking everyone out even more.
Yeah. It's a tough situation. But it wasn't just about immigrants. There were all sorts of other suspects, too. Some people even thought it might have been Queen Victoria's grandson.
Wait, what? Queen Victoria's grandson. Now, that's a conspiracy theory I've never heard before. You got to tell me more about that.
Well, it's one of those theories that sounds crazy at first, but some people who are really into the Ripper case actually think it might be true. The theory is about Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, and they say he could have been involved in the murders.
That's insane. So what's the evidence? Or is it all just, like, guessing?
It's mostly circumstantial, like a lot of the Ripper theories. There's nothing that directly links the Duke to the crimes, but there are some weird coincidences and holes in his alibi that keep people wondering.
I guess that's part of what makes this case so fascinating, right? There's always room for one more theory, one more suspect, one more twist in the story.
For sure. And the fact that a lot of the police files were destroyed during the Blitz in World War II, I mean, that just adds to the mystery. Think about it. All those clues, reports, witness statements, gone forever.
Man, that's got to be frustrating for anyone trying to solve this case. It's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing. So, with all the fear going on, did the people in Whitechapel just sit around and wait for the police to catch the Ripper?
Not exactly. They actually formed their own group, the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. It was a bunch of regular folks who were fed up and decided to do something themselves.
A vigilante group, walking the streets of Whitechapel. That sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? They were so frustrated that the police weren't getting anywhere, so they started patrolling the streets, offering rewards for information, even hiring private detectives to talk to witnesses.
Wow, they were serious about catching this guy. I guess when people feel like the authorities can't protect them, they got to take things into their own hands.
Yeah, it's a natural thing to do, especially when you're dealing with something as scary and unpredictable as Jack the Ripper. But unfortunately, even they couldn't figure out who he was.
So we're left with this mystery. Jack the Ripper, he just disappeared as fast as he appeared, leaving behind all these murders and unanswered questions. Makes you wonder, what if we could go back in time with all our fancy technology? Think we could finally solve this case then?
It's tough to say, but yeah, the technology we have now would definitely give us a better shot. I mean, imagine being able to analyze DNA like we can today, or using facial recognition software on those old photographs could be
Yeah.
a game changer.
Right. To see what modern-day investigators could do with this case. Maybe find some new evidence that everyone missed back then. But, even if we never figure out exactly who Jack the Ripper was, this case is going to keep fascinating people, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's like this puzzle we can't help but try to solve, even though we're missing some pieces. And the fact that it all happened during such a crazy time in history, the Victorian era, makes it even more interesting.
Totally. It's like a window into a world that was changing so fast. Gas lights were being replaced with electric lights. Cars were starting to share the roads with horse-drawn carriages. And in the middle of all that progress, you have this darkness lurking in the shadows.
That's what gets me. That contrast between all the new stuff and the brutality of these murders, it's what makes the Ripper case so captivating. And we can't forget the psychological side of things either. I mean, those crimes, all those ritualistic elements, the fact that there was no clear motive, it's the kind of stuff that still keeps criminal profilers and psychologists up at night.
Yeah, it's like he tapped into some deep, dark part of human nature that we just can't fully understand. And the fact that he was never caught, never had to face justice for what he did, it just adds to that feeling of unease.
Absolutely. It reminds us that there are some mysteries out there that we may never be able to solve. But that doesn't stop us from trying, right? We're always going to want to find answers to make sense of the chaos.
It's like that saying, we can't always choose the music life plays for us, but we can choose how we dance with it. And with the Jack the Ripper case, people are still dancing, still investigating, still trying to figure out the truth, even if it's always just out of reach.
Well said. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from the Ripper case, that even some of the darkest mysteries can teach us something about ourselves, about our fears, our fascination with the macabre, and our need to understand the world around us.
So there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into the world of Jack the Ripper. A chilling story, a mystery that still haunts us, and a reminder that some shadows never really disappear. If you're hooked and want to learn more, there's tons of stuff out there. Books, documentaries, websites dedicated to figuring out this enduring enigma. But be warned, once you go down the rabbit hole, it can be hard to climb back out. Until next time, stay curious, keep those minds sharp, and remember, sometimes the most captivating histories are the ones that remain unsolved.